So when we're talking about medieval warfare, most of you are familiar with many of the common types of medieval shield, and there's a perception that as plate armour came in, shields were abandoned. And as we've looked at in recent videos, this isn't really the case. Certainly lighter armoured shoulders often used little shields like this, like the buckler, but even heavily armoured knights occasionally used various types of shield, from little targes like this through to hand pavvises and even great big long shields as well. But there's one type of shield which I've been noticing more and more, particularly in medieval English art, which we don't know the name of, and it is a bit of a mystery shield. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as many of you know, I'm an absolute armour fanatic, and I also, as well as HEMA and what we sometimes call harness vector or armoured fighting, I also dabble in the reenactment world as well. And so I'm often looking at how armour was used with different combinations of weapons and also the techniques for using them. Now, I think most people that know about armour will know that as armour developed, and this is my left pauldron here, we develop plates which essentially fulfill the role of the shield. So for a large extent, I don't want you to think that there isn't a general trend that shields became less popular for knights and men-at-arms, because they did. To a general extent, the plate armour renders shields not completely useless, we'll come back to why in a second, but far less useful than they had been in earlier centuries when people were wearing mail, aka chainmail, or a mixture of mail and plate. Fundamentally because when you have more mail or chainmail exposed, you're more vulnerable to certain types of weapons, for example, lances on horseback or arrows and crossbow bolts on foot. And in fact, plate armour was sometimes so conscious within the period, within the 15th century, it was so conscious of the fact that it was replacing and supplanting the shield, that sometimes these reinforcing plates, so this is a articulated pauldron as I mentioned for my left shoulder, the plate here, the reinforcing plate, sometimes even takes on the shape and form of a shield itself. And in fact, sometimes, I've just grabbed my little targe there for a second, sometimes we actually see little targes permanently mounted, or at least removable, but mounted onto the left pauldron or left shoulder in the place of a shield. In fact, we're going to be coming back to this point relatively soon as my new armour comes in, because, well, you'll see on the new armour there's something very relevant to that point. But here's the thing, when we're looking at the 15th century, one type of shield that we certainly see in a lot of German art is we would call as a pavvis, essentially. It's a type of pavvis, and there's a subset of that we sometimes refer to as a hand pavvis. That is essentially if the pavvis is the large type of shield, usually used by crossbowmen, sometimes used in sieges as well, very large, and it can be placed on the ground. Sometimes it has a spike at the bottom, sometimes an armour or strut. So it can be stood up like a little movable wall, and you can load your crossbow or load your gun or do whatever you want to do behind it. So it can be a little mobile fortification in itself. But there's a smaller relative of that pavvis, and that sometimes gets called the hand pavvis. And we even see these used in foot combats. We see them in certain treatises. We even see them in Maximilian's Friedel, for example. So these were used in foot combats, essentially in the same way as earlier shields would have been used, whether it was the Norman kite shield, or whether it was even almost like a small scutum, like a Roman shield. So they were used in conjunction with full plate harness, usually a sword or sometimes something like an axe or a mace, and one of these hand pavvises. But these types of shield did exist in other countries, but they didn't take the exact same form. And the examples of the hand pavvises that we often see used in sources seem to be particularly popular in Germany for some reason. When we come to England and France, for example, we see different forms of shield. Now, I'm not going to get into France because that's a different question, although it's almost certainly related, because you have to remember that certainly for the first half of the 15th century, some of what's now France was under English control. So Bordeaux, I think, was 300 years Bordeaux, and the area of Aquitaine around it was English, and obviously Calais remained English into the 16th century. So France and England's histories were inextricably connected, and that also extends to their armour development as well. But now let's just get back to shields. So What have I noticed? So when we're looking at the development of armour, I'm often looking at brasses and effigies. And those of you who follow our Facebook page, which is linked down below, will have seen a post I put up yesterday about the fact that we see these knightly effigies, and I often show them on this channel when we're talking about the development of armour, and you get these effigies and brasses. Brasses are usually lower status than effigies. Effigies are essentially a funerary monument, a sculpture of the deceased knight or man-at-arms, squire, on top of a tomb. Usually, when it's a sculpture, when it's an effigy, usually on a casket, on a box. Now that box can be decorated around the sides. Now, depending on the status and the wealth and everything else of the individual on top of the box, we sometimes find different types of decoration around the side. But one type that we sometimes find are what are called weepers. And really, you could think of these as mourners. So it's a bit like they're there to pay their respects to the person who's on the top of the tomb. And usually these are literal living members of the family. They're usually the sons and daughters, sometimes brothers and sisters, this kind of thing. And sometimes they're named individuals so we know who they are. But what's really interesting is we study the armour on top of the tomb, but often I feel the weepers around the edge, when they're present, and they're not usually present, but they're sometimes present, the armour on those people and the clothes, civilian clothes as well, the hats and everything else, sometimes gets overlooked. Now, when we couple the weepers with the effigies, we notice an interesting thing, and that is on English tomb effigies, we see a type of shield. And a type of shield we could loosely term a hand pavvis, but it doesn't look like the German hand pavvises, or indeed the sort of some of the French ones. It seems to be a distinctive style. Now, there's several questions that arise from that. Number one, what was it called? We don't know. Number two, was it actually used in warfare? We don't know. And the reason we don't know is rather interesting. It's because a lot of the artistic sources from the period are not from England. We actually don't have many English artistic sources from, let's say, the Wars of the Roses period of warfare. Most of the artistic sources we have are from Flanders or France or Italy or whatever. We don't actually have an awful lot of English art of this period. So, for example, we don't therefore have a lot of representation of shields like this, but it is on the English tombs. Is it just, this is the final point, is it just to show heraldry? Are those shields just there to show the heraldic devices, and they weren't something actually really used in warfare very much? Now, there are other artistic sources which do show shields like this, and one of those being the Roos roll from Richard III's time. So these do exist. So they exist in numerous English sources of different formats. They also appear on at least one effigy on the top actually has one of these shields. So there's a remarkable amount of consistency. Now, some of them look like an elongated version of one of these tages. Quite a bit longer than this, about the size of a normal shield. Some of them even appear almost as long as a Norman shield, and they certainly look about as big as some of the hand pavvises. So I don't think it's implausible, that they were used and they did exist, and they're not just an artistic or heraldic device for the tomb. So what were they using them for? Now, I'm going to keep this fairly brief because this is potentially a huge topic and I don't want to make a huge video today. Why possibly were these shields popular in England? Well, I have a theory. So we don't actually know an awful lot about how the battles of the Wars of the Roses were fought. For those of you who don't know, the 100 Years' War was essentially between England and France, although it's a bit more complicated than that because the Burgundians were allied with the English, and English troops served as mercenaries in other armies, and additionally there were various other French fighting on the English side, and the Scots fought on the French side, so it gets very complicated. But fundamentally, the 100 Years' War comes to an end in 1453, give or take. And after that, we start to see a period in England, essentially of an aristocratic civil war, dynastic civil war, that involved actually quite a lot of the population and was fought all over England, from the north to the south, east to the west. And it really changed warfare for the English because suddenly they had been a predominantly longbow-based army. So we're looking at something like 3 out of 5 soldiers being archers and the rest being various forms of other infantry, knights, men-at-arms, spearmen, whatever, against French armies that were put together in a completely different way. But suddenly they were fighting each other, and now you get lots of archers versus archers. Now, in an environment where suddenly you're not used to being the ones shot at with lots of arrows, to now you are the ones being shot at with lots of arrows, what might suddenly become really useful? And it doesn't kind of matter how good your armour is, because this isn't necessarily for close-in hand-to-hand combat, although shields and hand pavvises were used in full armour with shields, as I've mentioned. If you're going to have to advance, if you're a Lancastrian and you're advancing on the Yorkists at a place like Towton in 1461, and you're having large volumes of arrows shot your way, what would be a really comforting and nice thing to have to hold in front of your sallet or in front of your armour, which is inevitably going to have some gaps at some points? A shield. So I have a sort of pet theory that large shields might have had a sort of return, a slight vogue of popularity, because suddenly English people were fighting other English people with lots of archers. Just a theory. There might be other reasons, and certainly, as I say, hand pavvises were used in France and were used in Germany and even in Italy as well and other places. So just a theory, we're going to leave that one there, but really to say this distinctive style of hand pavvis, if we call it that, we don't really know what the English would have called it. Maybe they just called it a pavvis. I don't know. We need to do more research on this, but it does seem to be a distinctively English medieval style of long shield, which seems to have had a return to popularity between about 1460 and 1480. And I think this has been largely overlooked by the arms and armour community, and we really need to do some more research on it. So anyway, there we go. I've opened up the topic. As I find out more, I will probably come back to this topic in the future, but I've shown a few examples here. I've hopefully made you aware of a type of shield you maybe didn't know existed, and it is a mystery shield. And you know, I don't know. I know a lot of the people involved in the front line of researching arms and armour, and I don't think anybody has really looked deeply into these. So it's something to do, and it's cutting edge stuff, hopefully. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. Will continue to be. Make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.